Good morning. I'm Carroll Muffett. I'm the president of the Center for International Environmental Law. Our second panel this morning will explore the environmental dimensions of TAFTA. I'm going to keep my remarks very, very brief because our panelists are very well equipped to walk you through those environmental dimensions. But I want to begin this session with a controversial, but I think frankly true statement, and that is, this is not about free trade. For having done this work for 20 years now, I don't really believe in free trade anymore because I've seen what it looks like in these negotiations. TAFTA is about unfettered trade. It's about uncontrolled trade. It's about unchecked trade. It's about unregulated trade, but it is not about free trade. And this, I think, is the fundamental challenge that we face as we go into these negotiations. And nowhere is this clearer than the environmental context. If you're looking for something to do late one night and having trouble falling asleep, I recommend that you read USTR's analysis of its 2013 report on technical barriers to trade, because it provides really profound insight to what sort of barriers, what sort of regulations USTR and US industry are concerned with. Toy safety. They're very concerned about excessive and onerous standards on toy safety. Biodiesel. Food safety. Food labeling. Apparently Thailand has some new food labeling and food safety standards that has USTR up in arms. Chemical safety, chemical regulation, radiation from cell phones. Apparently some countries are just going overboard in regulating radiation from cell phones. So when we talk about free trade in these negotiations, this is what we are talking about. As an environmentalist, I see a number of areas of real concern with this. For many years, we've been concerned about investor-state dispute resolutions, about trade agreements having a chilling effect on environmental regulation. But we've gotten to the point with TAFTA where we're no longer simply talking about a chilling effect. We're talking about a goal to have a braking effect, a reversing effect. Once upon a time, the US was a world leader in chemicals regulation. We adopted the Toxic Substances Control Act, which way back in the early 1970s was a first of its kind. It put us way out ahead of the world in chemical safety. But 1973 was a very long time ago. And what we know about chemicals and chemical safety has changed dramatically since then, and TSCA hasn't. Meanwhile, the world has moved on, or has tried to. Nowhere is this clearer than with the European Union's REACH legislation. REACH now provides a global model for how you can manage chemicals on a hazards-based framework instead of an outdated risk-based framework. REACH is so far ahead of TSCA that it becomes the standard that global negotiations are moving toward. The problem is it's making it harder and harder for US chemicals companies to get into European markets. So what's the answer? Is it to reform TSCA like the health industry here urges, like the labor industry here urges, like the environmental industry here urges? Or is it to reach out and slow REACH down and slow the world down, to put the brakes on better rules and safer rules? TAFTA is the answer to that. One of the primary objectives of TAFTA is regulatory coherence, and one of the primary drivers of it in this context is a desire by the US chemical industry to pull REACH back and to force regulatory coherence on a European regulatory body and a regulatory system that has gotten too far out ahead of US chemical safety standards. We see the same thing in the clean energy context. We see the same thing in the food safety context. We see the same thing with GMOs. And so when we express concern about where these agreements are going, it's not based on some abstract fear of new trade agreements. It's based on what we see the agencies that are behind them actually targeting. And with that, I'll turn this over to our two speakers today who will walk us through these concerns in much greater detail. Our first speaker is Ilana Solomon, who directs the Sierra Club's work on responsible trade, where she works to create public support for trade and investment rules that protect the environment and to shed light on the environmental threats posed by our current global trading system. Following Ilana is Bill Waren. Bill is a trade policy analyst for Friends of the Earth U.S. He works to protect the environment from the negative impact of international trade and investment agreements. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to wait 1 second to get this presentation up. So basically today I wanted to cover a number of issues that lie at the intersection of TAFTA, this trade agreement, and implications for our climate and environment, and was going to touch on 4 different issues quite quickly. If you want to go to the next slide. Essentially, I'll go through some eco-labeling questions, talk about natural gas exports and fracking, talk a little bit more about the investment rules we've been hearing about, and then on this environment/sustainable development chapter that may be included in this pact. But before going into the substance on the next slide, I would just point everyone to a little bit of the process. And in the beginning, Lori mentioned the 600 industry advisors to the U.S. Trade Representative. This is a screenshot of the energy advisors to the U.S. Trade Representative. And because I'm going to be talking a lot about energy today, I thought it'd be helpful to get a sense of who is really actively engaged in helping to shape U.S. Trade Representative's energy policy. So not on this list somehow is the Sierra Club or other of our allies, but we do have National Coal Council, Halliburton, GE, Chevron, Caterpillar, and a whole host of, the list goes on, other of the major actors in the fossil fuel industry. And I just think it's important for us to keep this slide in mind. When we look at the other slides, it's Citigroup and Walmart and Pfizer, and these are all public, so we can look at them on the USTR's energy advisory on their USTR's website. And there are some NGO representatives as well, labor representatives, but we are far outweighed by this very strong industry dominant perspective on the advisory panels. So keep that in mind as I talk about some of the energy issues that we may see coming up in TAFTA. So a little bit on eco-labeling first. Eco-labels can be an effective tool to give consumers more information about the energy content, the carbon content of the products that they choose, which in turn may allow consumers to make better decisions about the products that they consume, may push manufacturers to make more energy efficient products. I think it's definitely not the major component, but it's certainly a component of a strategy to deal with energy efficiency and to deal with climate change. So on the screen here are just 3 examples of different energy labels. On the left side, there's the U.S. Energy Star label. It marks products that meet high energy efficiency performance standards. The second label is an EU energy label, and actually the EU requires that light bulbs, cars, a range of electrical appliances carry this label, describing, again, the respective energy performance of these products. And the third label is an example of a carbon label. This one is one used in the UK. And this essentially aims, although not perfectly, but it aims to calculate the carbon footprint of a product, which is essentially the total carbon content used in the life cycle of the production of the carbon of the product. And I think all of these labels could potentially be at risk by TAFTA, by this trade agreement. And that's because environmental labeling, like other labeling and standards, falls within the scope of what will likely be the chapter in this agreement called Technical Barriers to Trade that some other panelists have mentioned. And while there already exists a WTO agreement on technical barriers to trade, the US-EU high-level working group suggested and proposed that this agreement include a Technical Barriers to Trade plus chapter. We don't exactly know what that plus means, but I think it does imply that there can be even less space, less flexibility for these types of environmental labeling, carbon labeling programs, because the chapter would likely build on the existing WTO commitments that already require labels and standards not be more trade restrictive than necessary, not present unnecessary obstacles to international trade, which I think are pretty arbitrary tests that these labels might have to follow. On the next slide, just to point that the idea that some of these energy carbon labeling targets labels might be targeted is not entirely far-fetched. Carroll advised us to read the 2013 report on technical barriers to trade that's up on the screen. And in fact, the U.S. Trade Representative does signal out that voluntary labeling programs related to energy efficiency have created substantial barriers to trade. So we do see, again, these labels as one part of the context for addressing energy efficiency and climate change that must not be weakened or undermined by this trade pact. On the next slide, just turning to another issue around natural gas exports and fracking and how that could be implicated by this trade pact. So a little bit of background on this. Fracking in the United States, as you can see, this map shows some of the major shale gas plays. Fracking is the process by which we dig deep into the ground with chemicals and sand and millions of gallons of water to unleash natural gas. There's been a burst of fracking activity in the United States that has created an enormous amount of supply of natural gas in the United States that has driven down prices of natural gas to a record low. But all with really significant harm to the environment, with contaminated water, air pollution, methane leaks that are contribute significantly to climate change and more. But this new supply and the very low price of gas has also allowed the United States for the first time ever to become a major exporter of U.S. natural gas. On the next slide, we'll see that countries in Europe have actually taken a much more cautious approach to fracking. In part because of many of the concerns about the impacts of fracking on air, land, and water. So this map actually just shows, it's a little bit hard to see maybe, but European Union countries' potential for gas production, but where fracking is banned, where it's allowed, and where it's beginning. And I think what's important to note here is that, for example, there's significant gas reserves under France, but France has a strict moratorium or ban on fracking in place, in large part, again, because of the concerns about the environmental and health impacts. Other countries like Netherlands, Luxembourg, Bulgaria all have moratoriums in place. Australia allows for fracking, but the cost of complying with environmental regulations makes it essentially uneconomic. And while there are some countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland, that have begun to explore, there is uncertainty about what the potential there is. So basically, European Union is in the exact opposite position of the United States, where they have quite a low supply domestically and are therefore they're a major importer of natural gas and looking to import fracked gas from the United States. The next slide. So the natural gas industry is equally eager to export fracked gas from the United States to the European Union and elsewhere, in part because they can earn a lot more cash. So this map just shows that where the price of natural gas, again, because of all that supply in the United States, is about $3 per unit. In Belgium, it's almost $10, so more than 3 times more. So the natural gas industry is quite eager. They're so eager, in fact, that they are building export terminals all across the United States. There's about 25 export terminals being proposed across the United States to, again, export fracked gas to foreign markets. And we have a lot of concerns about that for a number of reasons. Again, more exports means more fracking, means more pipelines, which leak methane. It means more infrastructure investment in fossil fuels in a time when we should be really fully transitioning and committed to transitioning to clean energy. It means higher electricity prices that affect consumers, but also could make coal a more cost-competitive option once again. And here's the additional trade hook, is that normally, while the United States Department of Energy has to do a public interest determination when it wants to export any natural gas, it has to look at what are the environmental and economic implications of exporting. That requirement is waived for any country with which we have a free trade agreement in place that calls for something called national treatment for trade in gas. So that's the point of our free trade agreements again. Trade agreements, it's about expanding trade as much as possible, so no matter what, no questions asked. So we were very concerned that depending on how this agreement could be crafted, that again, deregulating our government's ability, it would strip the Department of Energy of its ability to even examine whether exports are in the interest of the public. So no matter what you think about exports, no matter what you think about fracking, I think we could all agree at least that our government should have the ability to at least review and examine the impacts before forever ceding its ability. Next slide. Dig a little bit into these investment rules a little bit more. So again, we've heard a little bit about this under the guise of increasing foreign investment. These investment rules and free trade agreements have given massive rights, massive privileges to foreign corporations, such to the extent that foreign corporations are given the right to sue a government, the U.S. or governments in the EU, for rights and policies that essentially reduce, that the corporations allege reduce their future profits. So this process of corporations being elevated to the level of nation states is called the investor-state dispute settlement. Despite the advanced judicial systems in the US and the EU, the governments of the US and EU have suggested that investor-state will be included in this trade pact. And this is extremely concerning from an environment and climate standpoint, as well as other public interest policies, because of the massive proliferation of cases that we've seen over the years that directly challenge climate and environmental policies put in place by governments. So just as one example, this screenshot is Lone Pine Resources, a US energy firm based conveniently in Delaware, doesn't actually have operations in the United States, has actually all of its operations in Canada. But they used NAFTA, NAFTA's investment chapter, to threaten to sue Canada for $250 million under a World Bank tribunal for Quebec's timeout on fracking. Quebec, after much civil society, public advocacy, put a timeout on fracking underneath the St. Lawrence River just to study the impacts. Lone Pine didn't like that, said it threatened their right to mine, and is threatening this investor-state case. On the next slide, I just want to do a quick screenshot. Again, I kid you not, they actually did claim that the timeout was an arbitrary, capricious, illegal revocation of the enterprise's valuable right to mine for oil and gas under the St. Lawrence River. So last time I checked, I didn't know that the right to mine existed, but here it is on paper being used by Lone Pine. So we think it's absolutely critical that this investor-state system is not included in TAFTA, and that we have very narrow rules that would close the door to this type of cases. Again, I focused on the natural gas industry, but it could be public health, consumer rights, labor, what have you. Just last one or 2 minutes. This goes off something that Celeste was talking about earlier, and it's the two very different approaches that the US and the EU have taken to both their labor and environment chapters, which on the US hand have been binding and legally enforceable. And the EU's approach in its recent FTAs, free trade agreements, have been a trade and sustainable development chapter that has been really completely aspirational. So very quickly, just 4 elements that has been included in all recent US free trade agreements in the environmental chapter has been a commitment to not waive or weaken environmental laws and policies, a commitment to uphold obligations in multilateral environmental agreements, commitments to address conservation challenges in the region, like banning trade in illegally harvested timber and illegally taken wildlife. And they've agreed to have the chapters be enforceable, subject to dispute settlement, like all of the commercial chapters in the agreement, and subject to trade sanctions. The EU's approach in their Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, which they seem to be proposing for TAFTA, does include commitments to not waive or weaken environmental laws and policies, but then they just reaffirm commitments to implementing the multilateral environmental agreements, and they just recognize the importance of tackling conservation efforts like trade in illegally harvested timber. And the chapter, as I said, is not subject, it's not enforceable, it's not subject to trade sanctions, it's not elevated to the same level of importance as the other commercial chapters, but are just settled through consultations if there happens to be a problem. So this, I think, is one area, as Celeste pointed out, where the U.S. does have really a more ambitious approach that needs not to be taken at face value, needs to be improved upon, but I think that'll be one area that we'll have to watch. Fossil fuel subsidies is just another that I would mention that could be incorporated into an environment or sustainable development chapter, looking to phase out and really commit to the commitments that the EU and the US have already made to phase out fossil fuel subsidies to the industry. I'm not going to go into this now, but on the final slide, just to reiterate one more, the sort of final set of recommendations, there's more than this. These are the ones that I focused on in this presentation. But essentially ensuring that this chapter on technical barriers to trade, remember those labels, includes a very strong exception for environment and climate labeling, ensuring that the U.S. retains its ability to at least weigh whether exports are in the public interest, excluding investor-state and broad investor protections, including an ambitious, binding, enforceable environment chapter and labor chapter, including commitments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, and think back to the first slide, balancing industry, public, and CSO engagement in this process and agreeing to release all of the text publicly. Stop there. And that's my email. If you have any questions, please do follow up.
Hi, I'm Bill Waren from Friends of the Earth, and thank you, Ilana, for a wonderfully informative presentation, especially for organizing and hosting this event. And Carroll is always eloquent. I'm humbled to follow these two. I also want to thank my colleague, Natasha, at Friends of the Earth Europe. One of the privileges of working at Friends of the Earth U.S. is that we're part of an international coalition in almost 70 countries with almost 2 million members. And we find that we get real synergy and we get strength by building transnational coalitions and working internationally to address trade issues, but also issues of economic injustice and social injustice, as well as environmental issues. And my hat's off to Natasha, who is extremely learned on these issues and a pleasure to work with. I'm going to focus on the issue that Carroll raised, and that is the threat to the European Union's REACH program for chemical regulation. And it's a good case study because it highlights the danger of harmonization down under the transatlantic free trade agreement. Because while it's not perfect, the European program provides significant protections for public health and for the environment. And at this point, the U.S. program, the Toxic Substances Control Act, is inadequate, and we see a very, very significant danger, as Carroll mentioned, that there will be a harmonization down toward the lowest common denominator. In this case, it's the U.S. standard. And in many respects, we want to use this to illustrate sort of the systemic problems with TAFTA. Out at a table at the registration desk, I have a thicker paper that covers 12 separate issues that we have with the U.S.-EU agreement as it's outlined in the high-level working group report. But I think that the technical barriers to trade issues, the chemical issues, are characteristic and just tell a frightening story, not a good story, of what may happen if we don't build this transatlantic partnership. As Carroll and Ilana mentioned, the focus here is on non-tariff barriers to trade. It's on harmonizing regulations down. And in particular, in this circumstance, it relates to the chapter on technical barriers to trade. And but it also applies to the chapter on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, the services chapter, which the high-level working group said not only should be WTO plus, but it should have the highest level of liberalization, which is trade talk for deregulation. And then, as Carroll mentioned, this WTO plus regime of deregulation, in the case of TBT and chemicals, but also in other areas, is multiplied by the ambitions of the high-level working group, which set out trade negotiating objectives to meld this all into a regulatory coherence framework, a regulatory coherence chapter, no doubt, similar to the one we saw in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And basically, regulatory coherence is jargon for the use of reductionist cost-benefit analysis and other kinds of quantitative analysis of environmental and health issues that cannot always be quantified. And there's a very, very severe risk that Europe would face something like an OIRA plus, for those of you who follow the OMB regulatory process, overseeing REACH and other European programs. And then the focus on chemicals. As Carroll mentioned, a good bedtime reading is the 2013 USTR report on technical barriers to trade barriers. And it's very clear that REACH is being targeted by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, so it's not ambiguous or hypothetical. It's quite specific. In addition to that, if you look at the history of REACH, the United States government strongly lobbied against its adoption in its current form, and that's been documented. It's even in a Congressional Research Service report in terms of the long history of U.S. opposition to REACH at the behest of the U.S. chemicals industry. And in addition, the U.S. opposition to this effective program is well documented in the World Trade Organization TBT committee meetings. And clearly the U.S. Industry and government goal is the harmonization down, or perhaps the mutual recognition that others have talked about in the past. And this harmonization down toward the Toxic Substances Control Act is particularly of particular concern because of four things. One, there's a real burden of proof issue that distinguishes REACH from TSCA. In the European system, the burden of proof generally is on the chemical company to show that its product is safe, that it's an application of the precautionary principle, that if you're going to put this on the market, you need to show us that it's going to be safe for the environment and for the public health. Whereas under the U.S. regulatory system, the burden is disproportionately upon government to both pay for and evaluate and prove that it's unsafe, and sometimes proving a negative is extremely difficult, especially when you have limited resources. Another problem with the current U.S. system is that something like 62,000 chemicals that were currently on the market way back when the act was adopted were grandfathered in, and at least the primary evaluation and controls applying to the dangerous chemicals do not apply to many of these chemicals. Many of the thousands of chemicals that are on the market in the United States have never been tested and evaluated and restricted. There's also a tough judicial review standard that's been built into and then elaborated in the U.S. system. Ordinarily, a U.S. agency only has to meet an arbitrary and capricious test, a very deferential test to agency expertise, whereas they have a very rigorous test of judicial review, whereby EPA has to show that it has produced substantial evidence to justify a regulation. And finally, the TSCA provides very substantial protections for trade secrets, meaning that healthcare providers and public health officials are unable to get the information they need to protect people from hazardous chemicals. REACH, on the other hand, provides a very systematic review of its registration system, review of chemicals as they go on the market, and evaluation of those chemicals, and then authorization of chemicals under a fairly rigid system that's based on the precautionary principle, as we discussed before. And the focus here is on those most dangerous chemicals, the carcinogens, the mutagens, the chemicals that accumulate, they're bioaccumulative, and so forth, as well as the endocrine disruptors, which have an impact on fertility and other issues. And again, the burden of proof under the European system is on the company to show safety, and it's more comprehensive, and it covers downstream users as well as manufacturers. So I think that there's no disputing the fact that this will be a major issue in the TAFTA negotiations. I think it's something that we have to bird dog on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think that it provides an opportunity to look at the structure of the agreement in terms of what's covered by each of these chapters. What are the definitions in terms of what policies and what laws are covered, the use of a positive rather than negative list for coverage. But more than anything else, I think it calls for across-the-board environmental exception in the TBT chapter, the SPS chapter, the services chapter, and most of the other chapters of the agreement. And again, we've got some materials out in the hallway, not only our comprehensive report on the 12 issues that we're concerned about, but also a blog post that focuses on the chemicals reach issue, and another one which focuses on InvestorState as it applies to the fossil fuel industry. So again, thank you very much, and thank you again, Natasha.
When we were setting up this panel, all of us agreed that the richest conversation would come from talking with you and answering your questions rather than focusing on our own presentation. So we intentionally kept our presentations very short. We have about 30 minutes for conversation with you, and so I'll encourage the other panelists to maybe come up so we can have a more dynamic conversation. I already have a couple of questions, but before we dive in, I just want to offer a lighter note than we began with, which is that it is possible to envision not free trade but better trade. It is possible to envision agreements that use trade to improve our lives, to improve labor rights, to improve the environment. But that depends on a few things. It begins on laying the roadmap out correctly at the beginning, and it depends on getting everyone in the room to develop that roadmap and pursue it together. And this is one of the things that we've talked about only a little bit here today, is that one of the big challenges that we see for TAFTA, and one of the critical needs for getting it right, is greater public participation, greater transparency, greater openness. I'll say that this resonates particularly for us at CL, given that just a couple of weeks ago we lost a case against USTR that we had been litigating for more than a decade under the Freedom of Information Act, requesting a negotiating document from the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, which has been defunct for years, but involving a critical term that will be as relevant to this agreement as it was to the FTAA, and as it has been to numerous investment treaties before and after. The public cannot participate in a meaningful way. Policymakers cannot participate in a meaningful way unless we have access to information, access to the processes, and access to the negotiating documents on an equal footing with the industries who so shape the agendas and the negotiations themselves. And so if we want to work together for a better trade agreement, then that is the way to do it. And with that, I'll move us into our first question. What can rank and file people do to influence the TAFTA negotiations?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm going to think a little bit about our work to influence the negotiations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is the other massive agreement that's being negotiated between the United States and now 11 other countries. And I think one of the biggest things we can do is really spread the word. There is very little information getting out to the public and to communities about the impacts of these trade pacts, in large part because they are negotiated with such little transparency and such great secrecy. So whatever you found from today, whatever you know about this pact that resonates with you, I think we can all help folks who are listening in the room and elsewhere set up community events, get talking points together to meet with your member of Congress, ask your member of Congress to demand that the texts all be released. I think, like Carroll said, one of the biggest hindrances to being able to actually influence these talks is not having the right information. I've been to many of the rounds of the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks, and we do a great job of giving our talking points, but we don't know what's actually being discussed, so it's very much a one-way conversation, which makes it very, very difficult to influence. So I would really start with getting out the word to the communities, start weighing in now with your member of Congress to start raising your concerns, asking your member of Congress to raise concerns with the U.S. Trade Representative. The media has also been fairly unengaged in trade issues recently. I think they're actually quite as much shut out of the process as we are. So Sierra Club, for example, has an activist toolkit on our website for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that gives individuals information on how to educate yourself, your community, your policymaker, but also the media in terms of writing letters to the editors or opinion pieces, But it's really about making sure this conversation is very broad and really gets out there on whatever issue really resonates with you, because I think that'll be the best way that we can actually shift public opinion and influence policymakers. Okay, and I just want to do one plug. So if people online want to ask questions, you can ask them, is it tweeting them? Tweet them to tafta@citizenstrade.org. Email tafta@citizenstrade, CITIZENS, trade.org.
I'd like to second everything that Ilana said, but I'd also like to put particular emphasis on the need to talk to the press in the United States, and second, the need to reach out to our brothers and sisters in Europe and make those transatlantic connections, because I think in many respects our best opportunities to either fix or finish this deal will happen in Europe. We'll still have a good fighting chance here in the United States, but it's very important for people in Europe to get firsthand accounts of, for example, how bad toxic chemicals regulation is in the United States compared to the European system, and there are many other examples. We need to get that message out to our own press, but we need to get it out to our brothers and sisters in Europe, so that that message gets out, especially to the European parliaments and to the European member states who are in a position to change the course of these negotiations or bring them to an end ultimately.
Thanks, Bill. What justifications do ISDR advocates have for including it in TAFTA?
So that's investor-state dispute resolution. That's the process that we talked about, where corporations elevate to the level of state and able to sue governments over laws and policies. So I think one of the questions here is, who is advocating for investor-state dispute settlement in addition to the governments? And that is, not surprisingly, some of the same corporations that I showed on my screenshot. And in fact, you can see in the submissions that the public and industry made to the U.S. Trade Representative, there's one submission of, say, Chevron, and their entire submission focused on ensuring that there's strong investor-state dispute settlement and strong investor protections. And I think there's tremendous industry pressure on governments to include these strong provisions, because they win. They win a lot of cash. I mean, the cash compensation that is afforded from governments, from taxpayer dollars to the corporations, is tremendous. Again, these cases are not hypothetical. There have been over 500 cases to date against about 95 governments, and the corporation wins, or the case settles, but often with some compensation, about 60% of the time. So there's a lot for industry, for massive multinational corporations to win, and there's tremendous pressure on governments to afford those rights and privileges to corporations. So it's sort of under the guise, again, of protecting investments, but actually the literature shows that there's very little to no correlation between actual investment, foreign direct investment, and the commitments that governments sign up to, including investor-state dispute settlement. Investment has to do much more with other things like infrastructure and energy and workforces, education levels. It's really not about these rules, and there are many studies that show that.
Decades ago, these investor-state settlement provisions had their basis in human rights claims, of all things. Companies would invest in foreign countries and argue that their investments were expropriated on completely illegitimate grounds, or destroyed on completely illegitimate grounds. And in some cases, those cases were legitimate. Those claims were legitimate. Many other cases, they were not. But we've gone far beyond that in the decades that have followed. And what we see is that investor-state dispute resolution has proliferated in one agreement after another, after another, after another. And whatever its foundations in history, what it now serves as is an alternate group of tribunals that allow corporations to circumvent legitimate democratic policy processes in states around the world. We've been involved with FOA and others in a case where a Canadian company set up in the Cayman Islands to avoid tax liability, opened a mine in El Salvador, couldn't get the permit after its environmental, after the mine didn't pass environmental review. In the meantime, the people of El Salvador launched a national public policy dialogue on whether mining was the right future for El Salvador. In response to that, the Canadian company, which now couldn't open its mine as this de facto moratorium was happening, closed up shop in the Cayman Islands, reopened as a business in Reno, Nevada, and sued El Salvador under the U.S. Central American Free Trade Agreement. This is how we see these agreements used over and over and over again. And I think the thing that U.S. companies and U.S. regulators should recognize is that Europe has far more bilateral investment treaties than we do. And this sort of gamesmanship that we see under CAFTA, that we see under NAFTA, will expand dramatically for U.S. laws as in the face of new investor agreements with the European Union. We've got another question online, but before we take that, I wanted to check and see if there are any questions from the room. If you could speak very loudly.
I wanted to ask you, do you see a strong position coming from the WTO, and if that position has any influence on how these negotiations are going to be conducted?
So the question is, do we foresee a strong position coming from the WTO, and do we anticipate it having an influence on the negotiations? Bill?
I think the pressure goes the other way, in that I think both the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations and the transatlantic negotiations are intended to put pressure on the WTO and the membership of the WTO to be more compliant with the developed world's agenda in Geneva, and to the multinational corporate agenda in Geneva. The United States and some other developed countries have been very frustrated by the increasing influence and technical expertise, particularly the so-called BRICS, Brazil, China, Russia, South Africa, and some of the third world network groups that have checkmated developed country ambitions. So we have our problems with the WTO at Friends of the Earth, believe you me. But there's no investor-state dispute resolution in the WTO, we've had real problems with the technical barriers to trade chapter in the WTO. It's one of our biggest concerns because there's no general exception that applies to environment or public health or to natural resources issues in the TBT chapter, and environmental cases are migrating to that chapter because there is no exception, and we've had some very unfavorable cases. But in perspective, I think we can envisage a far worse scenario under a TBT plus, under a TAFTA chapter, and I think the developed countries are going to be under increased pressure if these two deals are pulled off to join in the transatlantic and trans-Pacific blocks. I mean, you see pressure already that's brought Japan into the TPP negotiations. So I'm very concerned that this is in many respects power politics, both economically and diplomatically, and the U.S. is laying down its model and saying, if you want access to the most lucrative market in the world, then you have to play by our rules. So I'm very worried about that, sort of the politics of international trade.
Thanks, and I would echo that. I would echo Bill's sentiment on that, and say that in fact it's the explicit objective of these negotiations is to push that model out into the broader space, and not only move the WTO negotiations forward, but displace them in important ways. I want to take a couple of additional questions from the room, and then we'll go back to the online questions. Here and here.
I'm Brian with Bloomberg News. I had a couple questions about chemical regulations. Short, so I'm
you can provide some specific examples of products that are maybe allowed in the United States, not allowed in the EU because of chemical rules there. And is the issue more with the manufacturing or the distribution, or at which stage of the chemical process, I guess, you're most concerned about? And then finally, there was a chemical explosion in Texas a couple months back. I'm wondering if that kind of thing might be prevented EU-style rules were best.
I'll say on this, and I'll turn it over to Bill as well. Just a plug for Boshka Tunchak from CL's chemicals team, who's sitting right over there and who's done a great deal of work about this, and you may want to speak with offline.
Well, one example that comes immediately to mind has to do with the real threat to the ecosystem as a whole that results from the use, and somebody's going to help me with this name, it's neonic pesticides. I think it's
neonicotinoids.
I'll try to say that again. It's like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Neonicotinoid pesticides, and these pesticides are killing off the bees, which in itself is an environmental disaster, a central part of the system. But bees are pollinators. So they have a key role in the whole ecosystem in terms of pollinating plants and crops, and we're very, very worried about massive bee die-offs, not only because we're concerned about bees, but as an important animal, but it goes beyond any kind of mere conservation issue. We were talking about the health of the biosphere if these pesticides result in bee death on a massive scale. The European Union is restricting these pesticides. The United States is not. What we would see under TAFTA is pressure for the United States or for Europe to come into closer conformity with U.S. standards. There are plenty of other examples in the area of human health. But I would just note that what we're seeing right now in the industrialized world is a very significant increase in chronic diseases, learning disabilities, asthma, much more serious than asthma, cancer, and fertility problems that are associated with toxic chemicals that are largely unregulated in the United States and are increasingly regulated in Europe. And just to give you one example, I think we've all been touched in our lives by somebody who's had breast cancer or passed away from breast cancer. And right now there's something, I'm told that there are 216 chemicals that are associated with breast cancer, including 73 that are found in common consumer products and food. So this isn't a trivial issue. This is something that affects every family. Chemical regulation is urgently needed in the United States, and many of us are working hard to try to get it over the longer term. But right now we have to defend the REACH system in order not to freeze in place the currently unacceptable system in the United States, which puts members of our family in risk of cancer and other serious diseases. Did I mention Alzheimer's? There's so many things that are clearly associated with chemicals. This is not a trivial issue. We have to have effective chemicals regulation. We have to protect the European system.
Thanks, Bill. One more question here, and then I'll go to the online questions.
Yeah, I'm Dennis Olson with United Food. I just wanted to throw out this idea that, if you look back at the history of trade activism in the United States, as was mentioned earlier, we have had some victories in the past, derailing the WTO in 1999 and the South America, the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, etc. But I think those victories were because all of these constituencies, labor, environment, family farmers, we're able to say no against these agreements and have a united front saying no, but all for their own reasons. And I think the challenge that the EU-US agreement poses for us, not only here in the United States, but in Europe, is it's going to challenge these constituencies to go across our borders, to reach across these lines. And it's a very difficult thing because these are all very complicated issues within each sector. But I think we need to figure out where are the common grounds that are cross-sector. Where does the, like, so we've heard a lot of examples of the investment chapter on environment and the fossil fuels, but what are the labor examples of that? Labeling, I think, is another one. Sustainability labeling, eco-labeling, but what about, you know, fair trade labeling? Those kinds of crossovers, I think, are what are going to make or break whether or not we're successful in effective use of negotiation.
I would echo that, and it goes back to an earlier conversation we had about what can rank and file people do to influence this, and recognizing that there are shared interests, there are shared experiences, not only within different sectors and different communities in the United States, but with those same communities in Europe. There are a lot of commonalities, and where we have found the power to push back and shape these agreements, and in some cases to stop them, it's when we have refused to let agreements and negotiations like this fly below the radar because they are complex, they are far away, and they're couched in the feel-good terminology of free trade. When communities have come together and said, we're not buying that, we have some really tough questions and we have some clear expectations, we have been able to push back. So just a couple of more questions from online. Can international law be used to preempt TAFTA? The U.S. has ratified the Vienna Convention, for instance, and Article 53 says a treaty is null and void if it violates international norms related to the environment, human rights, etc. I can't imagine which one of us would take that.
You take the first stab, I'll follow.
Were TAFTA negotiated and ratified, it would be a treaty coeval with other international treaties. There are limits on what an international treaty can do. It can't violate international norms that are recognized as fundamental. So, for instance, you can't have a trade treaty that requires genocide. A treaty that did that would be null and void. So there are real limits on agreements like this. And even more importantly, it points to another fundamental constraint on agreements like this, is that they are treaties. They are international contracts. They are not constitutions. And we must always remember that. One of the most profound effects for these agreements is what they do on the adoption of new rules going forward. And time again, we see legislators in the U.S., in Europe, in other places coming to us, coming to partners and saying, can we really do this? We have industry telling us if we adopt this new standard, if we adopt this new rule, if we even consider it, we're violating WTO obligations. The truth is, the WTO is not a constitution. Agreements like this are not constitutions. They are contracts. They are subject to constraints, and countries take on other treaties that are coeval in are equal in stature. And the key is not to elevate these agreements to the stature of global constitutions, because they are not that, and that's not their intention. How is TAFTA an investment push to assert control or advantages over resources? You want to take that one? Or Bill?
Yeah, I think there are a whole variety of ways in which resources are affected. To go to InvestorState dispute resolution, the notorious investment chapter, if you look at the substance of most of the cases that have been filed in the past, these are natural resources issues. Disproportionately, oil companies, natural gas companies, mining companies, to a lesser extent, water issues. Not to a lesser extent, but water issues also may be regarded as a natural resources issue. So the investor state provision is going to have a huge impact on on natural resources, extractive industry, the use of water, and some mention has already been made about the comments filed by Chevron Corporation in favor of the TTIP. It was almost, I wish I could have written it myself, only I would have thought I was being too hyperbolic in terms of their ambitions to engage in fracking in the Baltic and their expansive holdings and rights to drill and exploit natural resources in Europe, and how they want to be protected from any changes in their regulatory environment over the longer term decades of their investment. Basically, they stated the case that I would make against InvestorState in the natural resources area. And there are many other examples as well. Water is another one to watch, with a lot of the multinational water companies being European.
So we have about 5 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is take one more question from the room and one more question from online, and that should wrap up.
Hi, Cecilia Wexler, concerned scientist. I have a question about the investor-state dispute resolution. You know, we have conservatives in this country that really are concerned about states' rights and have concerns about the United Nations being too powerful. And I wondered if there were any conservative voices out there that have raised any objections or alarms about investor-state dispute resolution, because certainly even states would be involved. So many states are now involved in figuring out fracking regulations. I mean, it seems to me that this is a trans-ideological kind of issue, or could be.
The question concerns investor-state dispute resolution and whether there are conservatives who've raised concerns about it in the same way that they might raise concerns about the UN or other global agreements. And I'll turn to Ilana for a moment to see her thoughts on that. My sense from having done this for a long time is that investor-state dispute resolution is one of those issues that has on occasion brought people together from across the political spectrums at the grassroots level, but not necessarily at the political level. My experience with Congress suggests that there's not a small amount of cognitive dissonance within the Republican Party on these issues. But I'll say that I think there are a number of Democratic legislators who suffer from the same problem. Ilana?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I agree with Carroll. I also think it is an issue that can reach across Tea Party or other lines, and I think tapping into these sort of cross-sectoral movements is definitely an interesting strategy that some people are thinking about. Because you said state rights, I would also just mention that many state legislators are extremely concerned also about the investor-state dispute settlement process because of the implications it has on state legislators' right to govern. So there was a letter last year signed by over 100 state legislators from all 50 states rejecting investor-state dispute settlement in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. There was another letter sent specifically on the environment chapter from state legislators from more than 25 states that included a number of concerns around natural gas, but also the exclusion of investor-state dispute settlement. So it's an issue that definitely cuts across, and Dennis, to your point, absolutely. I mean, Egypt is facing a case now because it raised minimum wage law. I mean, this is an issue that can cut across every single, we can find a case, if you're interested in an issue, we can find a case that touches on it, be it at the state level or the national level. So I think it's a good one that pulls people in together.
Thanks a lot. And we're just at the end of our time. We have one last question from online that I want to make sure we get to. Is the American Chemistry Council's support for recent TSCA reform measures being driven by the need to define the floor to which TAFTA will be harmonized down? It's certain that we have seen, I think it's certain that we've seen differing levels of industry engagement on TSCA reform efforts. The environmental community, the public health community had worked closely with industry for some time in hopes under a previous version of the Safe Chemicals Act to develop some sort of compromise which would take us forward. I have to say that the American Chemistry Council's current support to the extent it exists for the Lautenberg-Vitter version of the Act, may say more about what's happened to the Act itself than it says about their concerns about reach. There are certainly important steps forward in this most recent legislation, but it falls far short of even where we were a year ago or more. And so certainly they're taking the EU and reach into consideration as they look at TSCA, but it's clear that the real strategy for the EU is not TSCA reform here. It's dragging reach backward through efforts like TAFTA.
Yeah, I would also add that talking about states' interest in these trade and investment issues, that one thing that has happened, as often happens in the United States, where federal regulation has been weak, states have come in to fill the breach, particularly the state of California. And in many cases, the tort system compensates for the lack of effective regulation. And at least at Friends of the Earth, our big concern with the Vitter bill is that it broadly preempts state law, including California law, which de facto sets a national standard in many areas, and that it also provides that an EPA determination of safety would be absolutely dispositive, determine the case when it came up in court, and then would thereby vitiate the effectiveness of the tort system as a check on dangerous chemicals. So whatever you want to say about the other provisions of the bill, we're very unhappy at Friends of the Earth about the preemption of state law, California law, and very unhappy about the attack on the tort system.
Thanks, Bill. And thank you very much for your time. And with this, we'll turn it over to our third panel.